Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company as always. Here's what's coming up tonight on the show. At a time when Victoria is facing some of the worst bushfires in 4 years, it's truly baffling to see that firefighters are still stood down because of vaccine mandates. I'll speak to one firefighter who remains off work even though the pandemic is now long gone. Now, what's Labor trying to hide? New power price information due out weeks ago is being held back until after the Dunkley by-election on Saturday. Well, today we learned the same thing's happening in relation to increases to health insurance. I reckon I smell a rat here. Plus, it doesn't matter how much you pander to the pro-Palestinian activists, it's never enough, with imams now set to boycott Labor-hosted iftar dinners. And it's happening overseas too. Joe Biden facing backlash from Arab American voters. And Saturday's by-election in Dunkley, it's on a knife edge, says both camps. The Prime Minister, well, he says there's always swings against the government. But that's not what he said in opposition when another popular MP, this time a Liberal, also died in office.
I think if you look historically, when there's a by-election after the death of a sitting member, in this case a very popular one, Don Randall, it's hard to get a swing. It's not a normal by-election.
But first, the government's obviously running scared over this weekend's Dunkley by-election. Every time he's asked, the Prime Minister and his front bench claim that the average anti-government swing in a by-election is 7%.
By-elections are difficult. The average swing in a by-election away from the government since the Hawke government, since 1983, is 7%.
Polling shows that it will be close. The average swing in a by-election against the government in a government-held seat is 7%.
Now, plainly, Anthony Albanese is taking out insurance against a cliffhanger result or even losing the seat on the weekend. Whatever happens, he wants to be able to say, nothing to see here. Like the shocking Voice result last year that sits squarely on his shoulders, the strategy around Dunkley reflects his judgment that it was worth torching his trust rating to deliver a $14 a week tax win for battlers. He might have grown up in a Housing Commission home with a single mum on welfare, but living in his two taxpayer-funded mansions has made the Prime Minister seriously out of touch if he thinks $14 a week makes a dent in cost of living pain, the pain that's consuming households right across the country. In Parliament again today, we saw the hand-to-hand combat between Labor and the Coalition for ascendancy in framing Saturday's poll. Now, in political language, you call this a battle for the narrative. Come Saturday, what will be regarded as a win in Dunkley and why? And if there's a loss, regardless of whether Labor hold the seat or not, if there's a heavy swing against them, how will they sell that? Now, by all rights, Labor should hold Dunkley. It's a 6% seat. The popular local member, well, she died in office. That makes it a hell of a lot different than when the incumbent retires or resigns in disgrace. At the most recent general election, there was a 3.5% swing to Labor, and that's contributed to the 6.3 current margin. Looking at recent by-elections, last year in Fadden, this is in Queensland, there was a 2.7% swing against the government. But back in Aston, in Victoria, a 6.4% swing to the government. In 2020 in Groom, there was a 3.3% swing against the government. But in Eden Monaro, there was a 0.5% swing to the government. Now, you've got to go back to 2015 to find something to justify the Prime Minister's claim, namely that a 6.5% anti-government swing in Canning is relevant. But of course, that was just days after the sitting Prime Minister in Tony Abbott had been rolled. Looking at every by-election since 2009, the anti-government swing has been just 0.7%. So a long way off the Prime Minister's claimed 7%. Indeed, if you exclude the citizenship by-elections, the anti-government swing has been just 1.4%. Now, if you've got to be generous and let's exclude the Aston honeymoon by-election result, The anti-government swing is still under 3%. It's just 2.7%. Again, a long way from Albo's 7%. So that claim from the PM over and over of a standard 7% swing in by-elections against the government, well, that's rubbish. It's utter fiction. But like so much this bloke does, he thinks if he repeats the line over and over again, he might just get away with it. Now, having spent some time in Dunkley in recent weeks, there is no doubt the key issue is cost of living. Power bills up roughly 20% on Labor's watch. Dunkley voters are likely to be seething about that other broken promise from Labor. And this is the promise to cut your power bill by $275 per household per year. Then there's the coming price rises that Labor's hiding now until after Saturday, like the big hike in private health insurance. That will hit 46% of Dunkley voters. Now, normally private health insurance rises, well, they're announced in December. Last year, Labor announced the price rises in early February. But this year's rise, experts are tipping it to be around 6%. Well, that's weeks late. It still hasn't even been announced. A delay described by health industry insiders today as weird and as unheard of. Then there's the coming extra subsidy for renewable power, the so-called default market offer that's a guaranteed minimum price for renewable power generators, which is unlikely to stop the rise in power prices, but will be a multi-billion-dollar hit to taxpayers. Well, that too won't be revealed until after Saturday's by-election. Now, add in the fact that people in Dunkley, like so many others in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, spend a lot of time in their cars. We know the cost of fuel is a killer. So too is the fear that the vehicles they want to drive will soon cost upwards of $25,000 more because of new federal Labor emission standards. Now, sure, Dunkley has a well-heeled wedge, but it's a seat with a lot of aspirational households where people work hard in order to get ahead. It's a seat where the community bonds strong. Even though it's part of broader Melbourne, it is a place where trust in people matters. Now, I know he thinks he's got away with breaking his word on these tax cuts, but the PM's issue is less about the tax changes and more about the damage he's done to his leadership. If he can break his word on tax, why would you believe anything he promises again? That's the problem. And right now, as he scrambles on the foreign criminals mess, as he holds back the new health insurance price, the new power price for Victorians, he looks more and more like a man who's got a lot to hide. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Inflation at its lowest level in more than 2 years, further fuelling hope of interest rate relief this year. Inflation during the month of January remained steady at 3.4%, food up 4.4%, rents remained steady, power up slightly, and fuel coming down due to falling oil prices.
Prices aren't going down, they're going up. And I don't need to say that to people right across Australia because they're seeing it.
Labor's changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts passed the Parliament just days out from the Dunkley by-election. The Prime Minister out spruiking the tax cut backflip.
We want people to earn more and we want people to keep more of what they earn, and that is exactly what this legislation will do.
Both sides of politics are playing down their chances at this weekend's poll. Anthony Albanese also confirmed he doesn't plan to attend the Labor function.
I won't be there on Saturday night. I wasn't in Aston on Saturday night, Laura.
The coalition claimed Labor is hiding increases to health insurance premiums from voters.
And right now we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and I think the government owes the people of Dunkley an explanation about why they're keeping this secret.
Of course, I want to make sure that the industry has as much time as possible to communicate the ultimate decision I make, but my overwhelming objective is to get the best deal for consumers, and I make no apology for that.
And the spotlight back on the conduct of the two supermarket giants. It was hard to miss two inflatable pigs roaming the corridors of Parliament. Independents Bob Catter and Andrew Wilkie taking aim at Coles and Woolies, claiming they have their snouts in the trough. The pair pushing the government to dilute the market share of the supermarket duopoly.
And I mean, are we just going to continue with them screwing the farmers down through the floor and charging the consumers $1 squillion?
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
I'll tell you what, that's what you call bandwagon jumping. All the inquiries are already done and they're out there in their pig suits in the gallery. Goodness me. Let's get across those headlines. Sky News host, National Affairs Editor of the Daily Telegraph, James Morrow, and our own Carolyn Marcus, Senior News Reporter, both joining me now from Sydney. I alluded to this at the top of the show, James, but I tell you, I really smell a rat. The default market offer, this is the power price settings, it's weeks and weeks late. We learned today too the Albanese government's dragging its feet on the increases to health insurance premiums. That has to go through the health minister. They're not done yet. They were early February last year. Still not on the table now. People inside the industry are saying this is weird. Now, it looks to me things are getting tight in Dunkley, hence this sort of panic from the government.
Well, yeah, look, I think you're absolutely right about that, Peter. These are two new pieces of data that we have that fits this narrative that the government and Anthony Albanese in particular is really worried about what's going to happen in this by-election, because if they lose it, they go back to one seat. If they and they puts the whole prospect of minority government into play at the next election. But beyond that, you've also got issues around whether or not the stage 3 tax cuts were advanced with the idea of Dunkley in mind. There's a lot to play with here, and I suspect that the polling is showing that when you look at the way Albanese has been spinning this, that this is going to be a very tight race. I think they hold it. I think Labor holds it, but by very little.
I still think it's Labor's to lose, but anything can happen. It's for me, it'll be an issue with the turnout. I'm going to talk to Cos Samaras, a pretty good pollster, in a moment. We'll get the drum out of Dunkley. Let's go, though, Caroline, to concerns tonight with more messages coming out of the Islamic community. In this case, the president of the Islamic Council of Victoria, Mr. Abdul Salman, who said it is absolutely legitimate, in his words, for Palestinians to resist on October 7 as Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped over 250. Here's what he had to say on Radio National this morning.
It is absolutely legitimate for the Palestinians to try to break the siege of Gaza.
No, I'm talking about October the 7th.
As I said, I'm not going to condemn the Palestinians for resisting. I'm not going to condemn the Palestinians for trying to break their siege on their territory.
And we also learned too, you've got 70 Muslim organisations in Victoria. They're saying that they will boycott the annual Labor iftar dinner. This is the one that the Premier and many ministers attend. They don't think the Labor government in Victoria is strong enough on a Hamas positive or pro-Palestinian position. Now, I think that's extraordinary. I think the Jews in Victoria would say the Premier and Labor aren't strong enough against anti-Semitism.
I think you'd be absolutely right, Peter, especially after the scenes that we saw outside the town hall last week in Melbourne when the council there were debating a motion on whether to call for a ceasefire. And we saw these horrific scenes of violence among pro-Palestinian protesters. Yet again, Jews themselves being arrested, being shoved down by these protesters. And where was the action? Where was the police action and all that? Where was the action from governments to shut down these types of violent protests? And yet here we have a very prominent member of the Islamic community, a leader in the Islamic community in Victoria, basically condoning the actions of Hamas and finding some way of justifying what happened on October 7, which was, I don't think I need to remind viewers, the worst terror attack since September 11, the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And this is a guy who is saying that the mass slaughter, rape of women and children, the burning and beheading of people and children, the beheading of a fetus, the torture of Jews in front of their horrified family members and friends is a form of legitimate resistance. I have not heard any condemnation of Hamas and its role in starting this war, in maximising the civilian casualties of its own population, only the sort of glorification of this type of brutality as some kind of resistance. It is shocking and it needs to be called out.
James, it's all designed to push the electoral buttons for Labor. So in the case of Victorian Labor, just like in New South Wales, we know there is a strong Arab vote inside Labor's factions, inside Labor's membership, of course, in some of their key seats. So they don't think, that broadly here, 70 Muslim organisations, that Labor's doing enough to support the pro-Palestinian cause. So they're pushing Labor, they're putting the Premier under pressure. And like we've seen, particularly in the United Kingdom, this bullying causes the left to change their position in relation to Israel, not because it's right or wrong, but because they are chasing votes.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the United Kingdom, Peter, but this is also playing out now in the U.S. presidential race, too. Michigan is a key state for the Democrats. They need that state. It's got 15 electoral votes. It also has a very large Muslim and Arab population that are furious at Joe Biden because he's, tepid on Israel and tepidly supportive of Israel. This is why there's so much rhetoric right now around there being a ceasefire, possibly as soon as Monday. That's what the White House is signaling. I don't buy it. I feel like this is an attempt, again, to try and silence this issue. But the way that all of this is affecting democratic politics in Western countries, I think, raises a lot of issues around, just where we go with a lot of issues, including, I'm afraid, multiculturalism and some issues related to that as well.
Carolyn, I know we've got a real issue with youth crime in Queensland, so I support extra facilities being built to detain young people because the crimes they're committing are adult crimes. They've got to have an adult response, in my view. But I tell you, when you're spending almost $700 million to build a new facility in Queensland and you work out the number of accommodation units, we'll call them cells, that's what they are, vis-a-vis the cost, it's nearly $8 million per cell. I mean, that's a waterfront view in an apartment. How on earth does this make sense?
I mean, it's a waterfront view in a house in some parts of Sydney, Peter. Maybe this is the only way young people can get on the housing market these days, get themselves arrested in Queensland. But look, apparently this is extraordinary, though. I mean, like I joke, but the figures are extraordinary. We know the cost of detentions is it very high. There's another detention centre called West Moreton facility in Queensland. I mean, those cells reportedly cost an average of $4.6 million, but almost $8 million for what they are calling home-like accommodation. You have to wonder what kind of luxury is going to be available for these crims when they actually get locked up. Extraordinary.
James, what's happening with One Nation in New South Wales?
Well, yeah, so this is pretty interesting here. There was a story early in the week that they were going to bring Craig Kelly into One Nation in some sort of New South Wales role with an eye towards getting a seat in the upper house. Now, Tanya Mihalik, who's the only One Nation member left in the New South Wales Parliament after Mark Latham's exit last year, she said she was going to pull the pin and leave the party if he came into the party on a state business. Now Craig Kelly has said, no, he's come in as the federal campaign director. They're planning on running candidates in basically every seat at the next election, is what they told me. It's fascinating because it looks like there's a way that they're trying to look to pull, some of that United Australia Party support under the banner of One Nation, even though Craig Kelly says he is now completely done with the UAP.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I'll watch with interest too, Caroline, to see whether the Prime Minister does what Malcolm Turnbull once did and hosts an iftar dinner at Kirribilli House. Given the lack of strong condemnation from many of the Muslim leaders, I would be surprised if he does, but we'll see what happens. It'll be an electoral cue for us as well. Thank you both for your time. All right, let's go to Victoria. Catastrophic fire danger warnings today. More than 30,000 people have been issued with evacuation advice and total fire bans right across the country, or for large parts of the state at least. It was supposed to be warmer during the day. It certainly was not. High 20s, early 30s. But just as I came into the studio, we're getting up to sort of 35s, 37s in parts of Victoria, and there's a very strong northerly. Now, you'd think those sorts of conditions, you'd want every firefighter out there on the ground. But Fire Rescue Victoria is the only fire service in Australia to still enforce COVID vaccine mandates. And that means unless you've got 3 COVID jabs, you might be trained to save lives and properties, but you won't be allowed to do your job. And that comes, of course, at a time when the Queensland Supreme Court has found that the state's COVID vaccination policy up there was unlawful for frontline workers. For more on this, I'm joined now by the Australian Firefighters Alliance Director, Josh Hawkes. Josh, thank you for your time. Let's be clear at the top, Peter. You're a trained firefighter in Victoria. It's a day of catastrophic risk and you remain stood down. Why is that?
Well, Peter, thanks first of all for having us and the invitation to come on. I must say that there's roughly about 50 firefighters that are non-compliant, as you might say, with legacy vaccine mandates. I say legacy vaccine mandates because they're the mandates that were instituted by the then Andrews government, and no further doses have been mandated across our workforce. So you might contend that the whole workforce is under-vaccinated. I am one of the 50 or so that has not been permitted to return to work because I was not compliant with those legacy mandates from 21 and 22.
We know that the police in Victoria have dropped their mandatory vax rules. Other states have, of course, loosened them up as well. I mean, given that firefighters turn up in protective gear, there's not usually human beings there when you're fighting fires, you don't interact with others. Why on earth do we still have these mandates in Victoria?
It's an interesting question, and you can look at the basically the inconsistencies that lie within the enforcement of these policies, because you've got airport firefighters performing the same role of medical response. Now, medical response is one of the key roles that Victorian firefighters play in the community, turning out with Ambulance Victoria to medical calls. But the Commonwealth employed firefighters at Tullamarine Airport, just kilometres away from Victorian fire stations, they've never been mandated. So they're performing the same role without mandates. And that's the whole contention at this point, is that somehow we're protecting the community by adhering to those legacy mandates, which is 3 doses only, by the way. Meanwhile, the whole workforce hasn't kept up to date with the Targis recommendations. So it boggles the mind. And you've got the situation where several trucks on a daily basis, and it's been admitted that they're flouting the minimum staffing chart just to get by when there's shortages of staff, rather than return those who didn't comply back to the ranks.
Look, you're right to make the point. I mean, I had my jabs. I haven't had any follow-up jabs now in a number of years. So whatever protection I have, I suspect, is long gone. So they're holding you to a standard with your colleagues that were vaccinated that will not have protection. If you're not vaccinated, you and others, there's no protection either. So it's almost like a meaningless measure now. And of course, we had that admission this week from the ABC's Norman Swan. I mean, he was a big advocate of COVID vaccines. He says, yes, there was unexpected side effects. And I know some of your colleagues, they went to have the jab, they had the first one, and then they had some serious injuries.
So Norman Swan was talking about this large study that Sky News actually covered as well. It was on the Late Debate with Liz Storer. She talked about this study that was widely talked about internationally as well, about vaccine side effects with brain and heart conditions arising from the jabs. Now, they tried to minimise that, but I can tell you that we have several firefighters who are on work cover for these things. So why you would be enforcing more risk of injury to those that have not been compliant, when you already know that there's a cohort of firefighters out there who have been injured previously. If you made the analogy about a piece of equipment or a piece of clothing, protective clothing, if it was faulty and it was responsible for injury, it would be pulled straight away and a review conducted until it was resolved. And certainly you wouldn't be putting more firefighters at risk with enforcing some sort of use of a piece of equipment or clothing. So this is very hypocritical. And with that study that came out, it just we've got a risk assessment that is still concealed, and that's been talked about in Parliament as well, last year, the risk assessment shows that there is a risk of things like myocarditis and such, and those injuries have been suffered by our firefighters. So that risk assessment's still being concealed almost a year on, and we are at a point where we don't have any answers.
Particularly in relation to fit young men too, which a lot of firefighters are, obviously. And just quickly before we go, I mean, you've got a very powerful union leader in Peter Marshall. He's often thumped the table in Premier's offices if half the rumours are true. Where's he in all of this? Where's his level of advocacy for these 55 firefighters?
It's a great question, Peter. And with the, I suppose that there's a lot of argument at the moment about the age of the fire trucks in Victoria and that they need to be replaced and they're a safety risk. I'm not sure why the union wants to argue on those grounds when several of the firefighters who have been injured and are on work cover because of the mandated vaccines that they've taken. Where's the outcry there? And the whole workforce should be up in arms that several of their colleagues have been injured and that the risks are there and admitted. And yet the union is silent. And that's why we formed the Australian Firefighters Alliance as a nationally registered company to advocate for these guys and girls who are sidelined, injured, they've lost their careers and potentially won't return because of their injuries, yet the union is silent. It's just, it's galling.
Josh, thank you. Thank you for your time. I know we've spoken before about this, but I thought on a day like this with total fire bans across the state, it just doesn't make sense to have mandates that aren't in place anywhere else in the country. Thank you for your time. Let's go now to Dunkley, the by-election, of course, on the weekend. But what's become clear, neither side's taking anything for granted. Labor, as I said, I still regard them as favourites, but they're well and truly trying to manage expectations in the parliament this week. Apathy will be a feature in this electorate. It's a metro media market, so hard to get the messages out that there is a by-election on. I think getting the vote out, turnout on Saturday night will be something we'll all watch pretty closely. But someone who knows the seat well, Kos Samaras, Director of Strategy and Analytics at the Red Bridge Group, joins me now. Because help my viewers, this is a national program, of course, help them understand Dunkley. The weekly income there is below the national average, yet mortgage repayments are well above the national average. What sort of seat are we talking about, and what are the top of mind issues for people?
Yeah, for those who live in Sydney, it's out of Western Sydney. It's a seat like Blair in Brisbane, Hasluck in Perth, out of suburban, heavily mortgaged individuals. Yeah, as you stated before, don't know all that much. Lots of people with TAFE qualification, lots of financial stress, and that's effectively the best way we can sum up most of the electorate. There is a southern bit which is really well off, which I don't expect to see much volatility. I think the areas that we should watch on the night are those areas that are experiencing a lot of financial stress at the moment.
It's interesting, you know, swing to the government at the last election, 6% and a bit margin, you'd say, if anything, safe these days. It's on the safer side. Popular local member. She didn't resign in disgrace, very sadly, as she died of cancer. So you wouldn't think that this would be in the maybe column for Labor. You think that this would be a strong result for Labor. One of the things that interested me, though, is when you overlay the Voice vote, though, there was a big movement away from Labor on the Voice. So this is a volatile electorate. Yeah,
that's right. And it's 12 interest rate rises in the mix as well. And we know that electorates that we identified leading up to the last federal election as electorates to watch because there were mortgage stress and there was a possibility of an interest rate rise, and we thought maybe that was going to have an impact. Look, it came along and it went. It really didn't hit the result all that much. But 12 interest rate rises later, we know that there is definitely an issue in the electorate now, and there's a lot of pain out there and a lot of anger. We don't know how that's going to manifest on the night. And that's why I think both major parties are kind of like guessing. I mean, seat-based polling is always tricky and very expensive these days. And so they are probably just hoping that, well, if you're on Labor side, you're hoping that the swings in a suburb like Carrum Downs are minimal, and that you can just hold your own in a suburb like Frankston, which is a bit more affluent.
Given that the result's not going to change the government, how likely are that people will say, well, fair enough, OK, I'm not going to change the government. I don't want to throw out Labor. I'm a Labor voter, but geez, I want to give them a message. They're taking me for granted. They're out of touch. They promised this on power bills. They haven't delivered. I mean, how much will this be used to send a message to Canberra to smarten their act up?
Look, there is a danger that's going to actually occur. We will see that out on Saturday night if that's in fact the case. But speaking to Dunkley voters, and we've spoken to many of them ourselves, the overwhelming sense is that they've been ignored politically for the last 18 months, that the federal government's focused on other issues besides the affordability crisis. And so there's a lot of angst out there. When we ask them, well, OK, so are you going to vote for the other side, being the coalition, and they're in two minds about it. So there isn't this, I'm going to vote for the other mob. We might see Labor's primary collapse and go to other parties. That's one theory. But we are seeing that across the board when it comes to both major parties, where whenever they lose votes, those votes don't go to the other major party, they go to minor parties. And we can see that in Tassie coming up soon. We've got a poll coming out on Friday where we expect a similar trend where Labor's not picking up any of the Liberal Party's losses.
Yeah, but just on that point, I mean, when they go the left away from Labor to the Greens or something, as you and I know, they come back in a very disciplined way to Labor via preferences. It's not like that on the centre-right.
Right.
And at the last general election, what I found was interesting, there was a One Nation candidate. There was a Palmer candidate. So someone who didn't want to vote for Scott Morrison votes off with these other two parties, not always disciplined in coming back to the Liberal Party. This time round, there is no Palmer candidate. There is no One Nation candidate. So give me your sense of how that might play out. And the other point is turnout. I mean, I think turnout's going to be a problem. How do you see that?
Yeah, turnout's absolutely critical for by-elections. When I used to do this for a living, as in run campaigns for the Labor side of politics, turnout was the main game in a by-election. It could either help you win it or lose it. In Aston, my argument is that the Liberal Party lost that seat because its voters didn't turn up. On this occasion,
agreed.
That's right. And on this occasion, we might see Labor's voters not turn up. So all it takes about 3,000 or 4,000 of your votes not to turn up. You lose a couple of thousand to your major opponent, in this case being the Liberal Party, and then a few thousand to minor parties, and then you're done. That's how it could actually happen pretty quickly. And polling from non-turnout, very hard.
We'll watch with interest. Kosamaris, thanks for your help tonight and unpacking everything we're looking at on Saturday night. The point I made there about the metro media markets, if it was a country electorate, you'd be able to flood the local markets there with media. It doesn't cost as much to advertise in a regional area, drive the vote to turn up. Of course, when you're trying to advertise in a big market like Melbourne, it costs you a hell of a lot of money. So you're relying on social media and targeted local drops and street stalls and that sort of thing to tell people there's a by-election on. So it will be interesting. Of course, here on Sky News from 6 o'clock, you'll see us all around the Melbourne desk. We'll give you the results. Looking forward to that. All right, after the break, the left eating their own with reports the Democrats are in trouble in Michigan. This is over their perceived support of Israel. Wednesday night, Kel Richards, and a hell of a lot more coming up. Welcome back. Still to come. Now, one of the ADF is struggling for military recruits when even the dog handlers have to undergo cultural awareness training. But first, he doesn't like to face the scrutiny of questions from the White House media pack. But US President Biden could find time to turn up on late night TV.
There's a process underway that I think if we get that temporary ceasefire, we're going to be able to move in a direction where we can change the dynamic and not have a two-state solution immediately, but a process to get to a two-state solution, a process to guarantee Israel's security and the independence of the Palestinians, but without them being able to, for example, invite in, another country to provide their defenses.
I'll listen to it. I think there's more questions there than answers. Let's bring in foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, Greg, I can't fathom why anyone would think it's a good idea in his office to put him up on late night TV like that on a serious issue such as Gaza, but there you are. Where are things up to in your sense of things, the ceasefire talk and everything else?
Well, Biden, you're right, Peter. Biden is now kind of in a twilight zone of weirdness, really. He can't do any spontaneous event, and even when he does manage to speak coherently, it's just kind of hallmark platitudes at best. He's under some pressure to force the Israelis to produce a ceasefire. There was 15% in the Michigan Democratic primary today voted for uncommitted. That means anyone but the president. So these are Democrats who are presumably going to vote Democrat, and allegedly there's some tens of thousands of Arabs who don't like Biden's relatively pro-Israel stance. Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, is clear. He'll do a ceasefire if it's temporary and it gets some hostages out. He won't do a permanent ceasefire or a withdrawal until he's finished getting rid of Hamas. And at the moment, Hamas still have, battalions of fighters and commanders in southern Gaza. A temporary ceasefire might be a good thing if it allows relief supplies in for the population and it frees some Israeli hostages. I think that's about as much as Netanyahu will do for the moment, but obviously the Americans are pressuring them to do the maximum.
I look at Biden and I can't see how he can sustain a heavy, media-intensive US presidential campaign, but no one's talking seriously about moving him on. There's this talk about perhaps at the convention he quietly steps down and they have the replacement there nominated on the floor. But others are saying, well, that's just a Republican conspiracy theory. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that's quite plausible. But plainly, Biden doesn't want to step down. Peter, you've spent more time with politicians than most people, and a lot of them are, God bless them, I love them all, but a lot of them are super egomaniacs. And to run for president, you've got to be almost narcissistic and solipsistic and, so much in love with yourself. And that's the best of them. That's the best of them. So Biden obviously feels like Trump. Only I can do it. Only I can defeat Trump again and all that. He'll stay if he possibly can. However, if it becomes obvious even to him that his presence there means he'll lose, he'll get out because he wants a Democrat to win, not least to protect his family from the legal troubles they'd face under a Trump presidency. Now, there is a certain elegance to leaving it until nearly the convention. If he pulled out now, they'd have to proceed with the primaries, and it's too late for any candidate to run. So Kamala Harris would probably everyone in the primaries would vote for Biden, which means voting for Kamala Harris. Whereas if he leaves it till nearly the convention, all the delegates are pledged to him, and then he can say, I free the delegates, they can make their own decision, and then they could choose someone other than Kamala Harris who might keep her on as their vice presidential running mate. My big problem with that scenario is that it's too late to introduce anyone relatively new. Like the best Democrat would be a state governor, like the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, or someone like that. But they'd probably have to go for someone who is already very well known, which is the sort of Michelle Obama scenario. These are wild scenarios, but these are wild times in American politics.
You're not wrong. We'll watch those conventions, both of them, Republican and the Democrat, closely when they come up in a couple of months' time. Thank you, Greg, as always. Let's go now to the panel and all the other headlines around today. Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam joins us, and former Howard Government Minister Gary Hargreaves. Well, Gary, the PM, I find this extraordinary. So keen is he at the ASEAN summit next week in Melbourne that he wants to show off his EV fleet. These are very expensive BMWs, $700,000 plus. So they're going to drive the cars, presumably from the depot in Canberra to Adelaide, to Melbourne. They're going to drive all these people around. I know exactly what it costs per hour for these Comcar drivers. This is extraordinary, all for a bit of PR.
Yeah, and isn't that really typical of this bloke? And of course, the TA that goes with the PR. Look, Peter, I think this is what's going to happen. these cars are driving, of course, to the most unreliable power supply in Australia, which is the state of Victoria, where, you know, you can't charge them overnight for certainty because the power could go out. I mean, that's just Victoria's power system. It's hopeless.
Spot on.
So what they're doing, and it's a bit like a secret operation. You know how those long-range jets fly with the refuelers along the way? We're going to see diesel utilities, because we can't afford to buy the EV ute. It's twice the price of a diesel one. But diesel utilities loaded up with diesel fuel and generators that are going to be there to plug these cars in on the road as they come down from Adelaide and Canberra, and indeed probably around the city of Melbourne. So they'll be secretly using, as is always the case, a fossil fuel to run their EVs. I mean, every EV on the road in Queensland, the greatest coal-producing state in the world, is powered by coal. And so this is what's going to happen. They're all going to be powered by diesel generators plugged into the cars, possibly while they're driving along. It's a refuelling operation, Peter. You know it.
We might all laugh, but Gary and Jono know that there'll be someone down in an apartment with a little piece of paper, a little brief to a minister outlining some sort of fallback scenario just like that.
Got an idea.
And Jono, we've got the Motor Traders, the Motor Traders Association. They have been arguing, as you know, where is the modelling behind these emissions targets? But they've also come out today to say, now that they've done some analysis, they are the toughest in the world. And I know down in Dunkley, because I particularly went up to speak to people driving big, US-style utes. What do you think about the government's plan to take this vehicle off you? Are you going to buy it again if it's going to cost you $15,000 more? I tell you, if they could have lynched the Prime Minister, they would right then and there.
Yeah, it's a further demonstration of just how out of touch a government can be. I mean, they get this advice from somewhere deep in the bowels of some building here in Canberra, telling them that this is a good idea to meet all sorts of international obligations. But it is, as you say, the toughest in the world. And I've had a series of motor traders through my office, both here in Canberra and down in Hobart. And it isn't going to generate better environmental outcomes. I mean, Gary's just listed out the folly of this pursuit of EVs. Now, I'm not anti-EV. If you want to buy one and if it suits your lifestyle, go for gold. But this regime they're putting in place to foist this upon people isn't going to make people drive EVs. Certainly not the people who opt for the big American-style trucks and cars like that. They have those vehicles for a reason. Often tradies, farmers, people who drive long distances, have great amounts of stuff to lug about. No EV is ever going to be able to do it. These people are just going to hang on to their vehicles longer. And if indeed they do end up having to pay these greater prices for combustion engine vehicles, that cost is going to be passed on to the people they work for, if they're farmers or builders. It's just madness all round, but it's what we're used to now here in Canberra.
Yeah.
I might add, before The Guardian or the lefties fire up, I was saying figuratively, lynch the Prime Minister. No one suggesting the Prime Minister would be strung up over his cars. But anyway, Gary, what about this recommendation out of the Afghanistan inquiry that our ADF dog handlers, these are people who have dogs that use them for protection of soldiers, let's say, or bomb dogs. You know, there's been some suicide bombers that have been held back because of these dogs. They've saved lives. They've got to now undergo cultural sensitivity training. You're kidding me.
Yeah. Well, look, why not? They should. You know, Peter, the Defence Department's now reached this amazing point where we've got the biggest island nation in the world, the only nation that inhabits one entire continent. All around us is ocean. We've got no real navy now. Our navy assets are in serious decline. We probably should be having at least 3 or 4 aircraft carriers and all the vessels that go with it, but no plans about that. And now we've got to send a memo to our enemy if we want to shoot them, if we want to attack them, and if we want to sniff at them because we think maybe they've got a bomb. I mean, this Defence Department has been completely beggared up by the whole Russell officers' approach to this thing. You know, it's an army and a navy and an air force is a great place if only you don't fight wars. And so we've got people who are more worried about the ICE Vovo allowance than, in fact, finding the bullets for the guns or the guns for the bullets and, indeed, the munitions that we need. Peter Dutton tried to fix it up. He tried to fix it up. Peter Dutton, as Defence Minister, tried to fix it up. And this mob are just drifting aimlessly, without power, without direction, waiting for the winds. I am really fearful of where Australia's at. We're being attacked from within by the way in which our key institutions are being broken by the woke. and we're being, I think, potentially attacked from beyond because we basically just ring us up, make an appointment, invade. That's where we're at right now. And be very sensitive to our culture, you know, when you do, please, to our enemies out there watching.
Donna, let's go to the housing crisis because we talk about this a lot. We know it is predominantly supply. So what I don't understand is that the dance the left is doing, and Labor is doing it, the Greens are doing it at least overtly, Labor's doing it covertly, about getting rid of negative gearing. And we find, because of all of the taxes now, particularly state government taxes, hitting landlords, there's been a 30% jump in landlords selling off their properties. They're saying, I just can't make it work anymore, we're walking away. Now, this is a reduction in the available pool, and we've got record migration. And Labor's Help to Buy scheme, of which then the Labor Party owns 40% of your home, God forbid, that's being held up in the Parliament.
Yeah, there's no clear pathway to delivering on any of the promises they've made when it comes to housing availability or affordability. And we've said it on this program before, addressing the supply issues is where the answer is at. The Help to Buy scheme sounds great, but it is a ridiculous proposition on every level. Government owning part of your home, and it's means tested, and if you earn $1 more than you're supposed to be within the bracket, then you're going to have to go and refinance. There's all sorts of trouble associated with that. But yes, people are spooked about investment properties. This talk of negative gearing and capital gains reforms that Labor will do, just they promised they won't, or it's not on their agenda. They will go there. Means people are selling their homes. So that has major ramifications for renters, people who can't yet afford to buy a home. But there is no real or proper solution coming from this government, and they talk a big game. You add in what you just mentioned, the number of people that will be coming to this country and making it home. We are in big, big trouble, including in regional centres where the same problems are being faced. And I don't think this government takes the issue seriously. It's all about a headline, and seriously, we're the ones who are going to be paying the price.
Exactly.
John O'Gary, thank you as always. All right, quick break. After break, it's Wednesday, and that means Kel. Well, joining me as he does every Wednesday, Kel Richards for Words Matter. And we're going to start with one of my favourite movies. This is the Julie Andrews Disney classic version of Mary Poppins. It's now got a big warning on it. It's accused of having racist language, Kel. Now, I can't remember what words in there that would upset people are, but what is it?
The word is Hottentot. Hottentot started out as a kind of jocular Afrikaans word for a particular tribal grouping in southern Africa, the people who speak the Click language. And it was used in, I think, a fairly inoffensive way for a long time. The word appears in the English language in the 1600s and goes on and on being used inoffensively up until the 1990s. But it's in Mary Poppins. Next door to the Banks family, there's Admiral Boom. And he's this old naval character. And when Dick Van Dyke turns up covered in soot and, you know, all blackened in the face, he says, "We're being attacked by Hottentots." Well, that word is in the movie, and it's now a derogatory word. So the movie, therefore, because it contains one derogatory word, has to be changed from G to PG because we don't want to poison the minds of the 5-year-olds, do we?
Oh, my goodness. We talked a lot about naval shipbuilding last week. Donna, one of our viewers, says, why do we always refer to ships as she?
Two possible theories about that. One is because the Latin word for ship is feminine. It's a gendered language. I think that's unlikely. The other one is the ancient practice of having a figurehead. A female figurehead on ships goes back a long way, representing usually a goddess or a mother figure who would guide and protect the sailors.
Pretty busty, usually, in my experience.
Yes, exactly. But apparently calling ships she is going. Lloyd's Register of Shipping now uses the word it. So the old classic calling ship she is on the way out, I'm afraid.
Hey, what about cheapskate? Can we fit that one in? We're nearly out of time.
A skate used to be a very cheap horse, someone who wouldn't pay enough, a really broken down, worn out old horse. Someone who didn't have enough money to pay for a proper horse was a cheap skate.
Ah, there you go. Kel, thank you as always. See you next week. All right, I'm out of time now. Back tomorrow night at 6. Look forward to your company then. Here's Steve Price.